So let me ask you, since I forgot to ask you, did everybody have a good spring break? I got to babysit a couple of days, got tamales made one day, just got some stuff done this past week. But I was glad, as I said, to get back into the routine, because we don't always, or at least I don't. I'm not good about, I think it's because I love studying so much that I feel like it's a guilty pleasure. And so if there's other work to be done, I feel like I need to do it, instead of sitting down with a book or something. So this gives me a good reason to drag out all those books and spread them out. So, but as I was studying this one, particularly because it's been 2 weeks since I wrote this lesson, those questions for you, I had no idea what they were going to say. I had to go back and study them myself. But as I was working on studying for this lesson, particularly most of Sunday, as I told you, I don't always go back. I don't go back and read the commentary from the first time that we talked through Hebrews until I'm ready to put this part together, because I don't want our questions colored by that first study. And it's really interesting to me is that as I was reading that, I thought, well, shoot, this is pretty good. I should have just made everybody a CD and just let you take it home and had it for yourself. But what was really interesting about it was, as I've studied this time, of course, pretty much the same scriptures, some of the same commentaries. I've got a couple of new ones. But what was interesting to me is that this lesson, as I wrote your question, took an entirely different track from that one. I'm like, how'd that happen? It's the same scripture. How in the world did this go an entirely different direction? And the only thing I can figure out is that I listened to several teachings online at that time. So that may have, I didn't pull out my notes to see, because I always put in my notes where I read this or where I heard that, and I didn't have that. So unless that was it, I don't know. But I brought out things in that lesson that never crossed my mind as I've been studying this one. So I thought, well, I need to use at least part of that. So I've included some of it for Gina and those of you who had those CDs or listened to that again. But what I'm going to try to do is, in your emails, I'm going to try to include the audio link, because that's when we started recording and putting them on SoundCloud. I'll try to include that audio link so you can listen not only to this one, but to that one. Because there's a lot, there's so much more than we have time to cover. Plus, I'll put it on the blog, so if you go to there to download your lesson or whatever, they'll be there in order to get it. But, okay, just to let's talk about the overview here a little bit. As you read this, and of course you had to go back to chapter 3 or chapter 4 to lead into it, but what questions did arise for you as you read this section? And as I said in your lesson, I figured that probably questions about Melchizedek would come up, but we're not going to dig into him too much in this lesson. But what struck you as you read it, or questions, or just any comments or anything you want to share about it?
Well, is it about chapter 4, or is it about where it says read chapter 4?
Yes.
About that? Or
yeah, I did not notice that. That's a typo. It should be chapter 5. Sorry about that.
Well, I didn't know. Okay.
But you did read chapter 5, didn't you?
Yeah.
You did do the lesson on chapter 5. Yeah, I did not pick that up until I sat down to write the next lesson. So sorry about that.
I didn't even notice it until you said that. I thought, maybe I read the right. No, I thought you wanted to go back and review that.
Well, we will bring chapter 4 into at least starting with verse 14, but pretty much talking about chapter 5.
There was one thing, and then after, in the beginning, but then I understood it a little bit better about Christ had to be made perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
that was like that didn't fit.
That's an unusual word, and particular. Now I forget what translation are you using? NIV. And that word is used so much, particularly in the King James and the New American Standard, and it's an unusual word for us because of what we think perfect means. But as you read, that's not what it's referring to. So, what else?
Oh, that's okay. I'm going to wait.
Is the bubble coming up over her head? You see?
I'm going to wait and see what you cover.
Okay. Well, what do you think about how the writer is directing these? Remember, we've talked about from the beginning that he has a goal. He has a thesis that he is wanting to teach them, and he's wanting to bring them along. But you can't, if you're going to teach something to somebody that's I don't want to say have an animosity toward it, but they might feel a little differently about it. You don't just jump in. You have to lead them along. You have to bring them along with what you're trying to share with them. Get them on the same page with you, because you may be looking at it differently at the beginning. So, have you seen how the writer is doing that? How he's leading them along? What do you think about how he's doing it?
It's kind of like, when you're writing, a paper or whatever, you need to have a hook. To get your reader's attention, and he throws those in along. So now let's do this, or when he says, "I have much to say to you, but
we can't go there right now."
No, but just those little things.
That's what he's saying. I've got so much to say, but I'm not going to go there just yet because they're not ready for it, and so he knows he can't go there with that yet, because if he does, he may lose them. And so I guess as a teacher, you have things where how you lead your students along. You don't teach the same thing, I don't guess, at the very last day of school that you taught on the first day of school. I mean, you would hope. You hope not. Anyway, So you build on it and you've led them along. Right. Can you feel his concern for these Hebrews? Is that evident? Or does it just feel like he's just teaching to be teaching, or do you feel his compassion and his concern? All right, so as I begin studying this chapter, it's kind of funny. I picked I guess it was sometime yesterday, as I said, I had to completely reacquaint myself with chapter 5 because I just finished writing chapter 6, and it's 2 weeks ago since I wrote your lesson for chapter 5, and I thought, there's only 14 verses here. That should go pretty quickly. And then I thought, well, then why did you have 5.5 pages worth of questions if it should go pretty quickly? So, but anyway, I remember I was looking back over some stuff and saw where Janet had, I guess it was the first time that I actually wrote a lesson, maybe when we were doing Revelation. And the first thing, I saw Janet sometime over the weekend before the Monday night group, and Janet said, well, there were a lot of questions there. Didn't do too many, But, as I've said before, the whole reason for that is to get you to meditate on and think about exactly what it's saying. But chapter 5 of Hebrews is probably, just on face value, the simplest chapter in the whole book to understand. I mean, except for the part about Melchizedek. But just at face value, it just says what it says. And it's pretty clear along those lines. Of course, I've got a lot more to say about it, but it pretty much means what it means. But I've learned so much about the words and what they mean, which helps make it clearer to me. But as we said last time, the writer has now entered the second phase of his teaching. He's moving beyond who Christ is, all those titles, Son, begotten, only of the Father, Christ, the Anointed, the Messiah. He's moving beyond who he is to what he has done. He, eventually and finally calls him Jesus, the humanity, but he's moving beyond that to what he has done. And from here on to chapter 10, the teaching will change as he expands on, we're calling it his exhibits that he's laying out. His fourth exhibit, and that is of Christ's priesthood and his sacrifice being greater than the human priesthood and the human sacrifice, or not human sacrifice, but the physical sacrifices. So in this, you and I, learn of how Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, is not only the fulfillment of the Hebrews' ultimate great high priest, he is ours as well. And of course, we have to turn to our application to get that. As we're studying it, we focus on the fact that these are first century Hebrew Christians. There may be unbelievers, there may be the fence sitters there, but if they're first century people. And so their view of things will be different in some regards than what ours is, but the application is still there. So as he builds up to this, everything before this section, the last part of chapter 4 and first part of chapter 5, everything before it builds up to it. It's kind of like the crescendo builds up to it, and then everything past it looks back on it. It is the foundation for everything else he will say up through chapter 10. So watch how he develops this teaching. In chapter 2, verse 9, the writer finally uses the human or the incarnate name of Jesus for the first time. The NASB says, but we see him who has been made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus. And then in the NIV says, but we do see Jesus who was made a little lower than the angels. So that's the first time he has used a human name. And we talked about that and said the reason for that is he did not want to use the human name up until that because he didn't want them to think in human terms. He had to get across the title, the who he was first before he could talk about who he was as a human. He couldn't cloud their minds with that at first. So up until now, up until chapter 2, verse 9, he had only spoken of the title of Son. But then in chapter 2, he begins to talk about why Son, that second person of the Trinity, had to be made human. In verse 11 of chapter 2, he said, in verse 11, he said that he had to be made human. For the reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. He's not ashamed to call them, these fellow Hebrews, his brothers and sisters. He was not ashamed to be, well, I guess we could even say brought down to their level. And that's what he was, actually. He was brought down to our level, to their level. And so the writer in that has established Jesus' humanity. Not only his deity, but now his humanity. Then in verse 17 of chapter 2, we find him mention the priesthood for the first time. And he said the reason he had to be made human, he had to be made like his brethren in all things. Why? So that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in all things. We find there the first mention of the priesthood. And then that thought continues on through chapter 3, verse 1. Therefore, because of what the writer has just said in chapter 2, 17 and 18, now, he says, consider Jesus the apostle, the sent one, and not just priest, but high priest of our confession. And for the first time, let's see here in verse 11. Yeah. Oh, in verse 17. He does call him high priest there in verse 17. But now he calls him high priest of our confession. But then it's almost like as soon as he says that, he leaves that thought. It's just like he just throws out this morsel. And as they're rolling this around in their minds. What high priest? He leaves that and goes on then to talk about Moses and how Christ, and again, notice, I want you to just, and I try to put this in the lesson, but pay very close attention to what Jesus, the Christ, is called. Whether it's Son, whether it's High Priest, whether it's the name Jesus, Christ, whatever he's got, pay close attention, because the writer doesn't just throw these terms out interchangeably. He uses them for a specific reason. I think I've said this before in other lessons, particularly like when you're reading the Psalms, there will be different words or names used for God. This is not just synonyms. The names are used specifically for a specific reason. They portray something different, whether you're talking about Most High God, or you're talking about Lord God, or you're talking about Jehovah or Yahweh or El Shaddai. All of those are different, and they're different for a reason. So watch that in Hebrews. What are you saying? How he's referring to Jesus at any given time. But once he leaves this thought off and he begins talking about Moses, now he talks about the Christ. And he said in verse 6, Christ was faithful as a son. And as that, he was greater than Moses by being over God's whole house, rather than being, as Moses was, a servant in the house of Israel, the small little contained house of Israel. Moses was faithful in that, but Christ is faithful over all, including you and me. So then after that, in the rest of chapter 3 and 4, he introduces that idea of rest, and how it comes not only by believing, but by believing and obeying. And those two terms are interchangeable throughout this book. Then in verse 14 of chapter 4, he comes back to the priesthood again. He spent all this time in half of chapter 3 through over half of chapter 4 talking about this rest, and then he comes back to the priesthood. It's like, you thought I was going to forget about that, didn't you? No, he comes back to the priesthood in verse 14. And as we'll see, as you've seen in this lesson, he will deviate it from this again. He'll take another sidetrack again from the priesthood. But it's like he just can't help himself. I'm so excited to talk about the high priesthood that I just keep throwing it out there every little bit. But he knows he can hardly wait to get into what Jesus has done, but he knows he can't do that too soon. He's got to build up to that. He's got to get them prepared and ready. Let's lay the groundwork for it. But in chapter 3, verse 14, he starts in. And notice, now he doesn't just say priest. He doesn't just say high priest, but he says what? Since we have what? Great high priest. We have a great high priest. And now these Hebrews are immediately going to think of their great high priest. And as we talked about last time, as you remember, he sets this up and he talks about what our great high priest, what Christ has done, our great high priest, who passed through the heavens, the three layers, we would call it the 3 layers of heaven, just like their high priest would go through the outer court and then the holy place and the holy of holies. He sets that up because their minds will automatically connect those two. How this one does this is how this one's doing this. He connects, their minds will connect that. So verses 14 through 16, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. And he's got everything there. He's got great high priest. He's got Jesus, the humanity. He's got the title of Son of God. Because we've got all that, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. And then he says what we can hold boldly to that. Let us therefore draw near with confidence, or come boldly to the throne of grace. And this is just really laid on my heart since we studied this, that we may receive mercy, and find grace. That was just so powerful to me when I just really realized what it was saying, that we may receive mercy. And you can't get grace without mercy. I mean, we're sinners. There is no grace for us if we don't first receive mercy. And he says we do that to help in time of need. And then he continues in chapter 5, verse 1. Remember, there's no chapter verse breaks. It just flows right into it. For, or because, every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, to do several things in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the misguided, since he himself also, and we're talking about the human high priest, is beset or subject to weakness, and because the human high priest is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins as well as for the people, and also for himself. And then he adds, and no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, as Aaron was. And so he turns from this great high priest that he said we have, to comparing him to the high priest that they have. So we have the rationale for what he's saying. So let's talk about the priesthood. One writer said that the Hebrews were not, of course, later on, it talks about Melchizedek, but said the Hebrews were not familiar with the idea of the Messiah being a high priest. And when I read that, I thought, I don't think I agree with that statement. Because they knew the story of Melchizedek. They knew, as we will read later, that psalm, and Psalm 110, they understood to be a messianic psalm. And it said, you are to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So I think they understood that some way he's going to be a priest. But now how that's going to happen, now that part they didn't understand. So I think they were at least somewhat familiar with the idea, but like I said, they had no idea how it was going to take place. They knew that the Messiah was to come from the line of David, which meant he was to come from the line of Judah. Okay, got that. They also knew that the priest came from the tribe of Levi through Aaron. So, yeah, how's this going to come together? I think that was probably the question. It's just like we read in Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant, that he would be numbered among the wicked, but he would be buried with the rich. Now, of course, we know how that happened. But can you imagine reading that from Isaiah? How's this going to happen? Or the fact that he would be a suffering servant, but he's also going to be a conquering king. Now, how in the world is that going to happen? Of course, we know, looking back on it, as I've often said, we read the Old Testament with our Jesus glasses. We know exactly how that's going to happen. But they didn't know. All they could see, and I love this illustration. This is not original with me. I've heard several people use it, but it's like you look at the mountains and you see one peak and you see the next peak, and you can't see what takes place between those two peaks. All they knew were the mountain peaks. So I think the thought was there, but how in the world it was going to happen, it's just like sometimes things are so confusing to me, I just don't even think about it. I just can't go there. I don't know how it's going to work, and so I'm just not even going to think about it. So probably they just didn't even allow themselves to think about it. But the writer begins in verses 1 through 4 of reminding them of just what a high priest is and what a high priest does. First, verse 1, he is taken from among men, which means what? Huh? They're selected, but he's chosen from humans, so what does that make him? Human. It's like, duh. But he had to lay that first. He's taken from among men, so what's he got to be? He's got to be a man. Okay? And He is appointed, or some translators say selected, on behalf of men in things pertaining to God. In other words, he's got to be a go-between. He's got to be a mediator. Okay? In order to do that, he's got to be a mediator in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. And as we read this, if we didn't know anything about the Old Testament, if we didn't know anything about the priesthood, and I gave you some scriptures on that, but you probably already knew that. If you didn't know that, though, and you read this, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men, it sounds like they're just picked. Well, I'll take you, and I'll take you. It sounds like they're just selected at random. And of course, they're not. It's like I said, every priest came from the line of Levi through Aaron. Levi had, I forget how many children Levi had, but there were three, of course, that we know, that Moses and his sister Miriam. Well, there were three. Levi had three. One of those then was the father of the line of Moses. Moses, Miriam, and Aaron were the children. But it came through that line of Levi. Everybody else in the Levites were Levites that worked in the temple and with the temple things. But everyone that came from the line of Aaron was a priest. If you were a male and you were born in the line of Aaron, you were a priest. You didn't get to choose what vocation you were going to go in, what you were going to do. You were a priest. That's just the way it was. That's what you were. And if you were the firstborn of a firstborn of a firstborn, you were in line to be the high priest. That all came from Aaron, firstborn of Aaron, firstborn of that one, firstborn of that one, firstborn of that one, all the way down. That would have been the line for the high priesthood. All the others in the line of Aaron were the other priests. So there was no random selection, but there was choice involved, and that was at the very beginning at Sinai when God made that choice. God did the choosing at the very beginning. But the key here is that they were human and they had a human function. And we can read that and go, well, duh, of course they're human. I mean, what else are we going to be? But the writer is laying that foundation to make a point. Very, very elementary in what he's saying here. Kind of a side note here, I found it interesting in reading this week that one writer drew attention to these Hebrews, these particular Hebrews reading this letter, hearing this message. And what you and I have talked about, and what I put in your lessons was in regard to the Mosaic priesthood, because that's what it's talking about. I really didn't think about these particular Hebrews, but there's really an important thing that we need to understand there. In other words, in this Mosaic priesthood, what he's saying here is what the priesthood was supposed to look like. They were supposed to be chosen from among men. They were supposed to be of the tribe of Levi through Aaron. They were supposed to be the high priests, were supposed to be the first son of the first son of the first son. That's the way it was supposed to be. But these Hebrews, these living in this era, this first century and during the time of Jesus, would have had another priesthood in mind. And that is what the priesthood had become in their day. Remember how different that was? When we're studying Acts, we've been talking about it. And we saw it in our study of John. Caiaphas and Annas, they were not first sons of first sons of first sons. They were appointed by Rome. I don't want to take a whole lot of time with this, but that could be a whole study in itself, but the nation of Israel that God ordained at Mount Sinai was to be, you can go back and read this in Exodus, they were to be a kingdom of priests. Regardless of what tribe you were from, regardless of who you were, they were to be a kingdom of priests. Every person in every tribe. The kingdom of priests were accountable to the tribe of priests, those that came through Aaron. And the tribe of priests were accountable to the high priest. And the high priest was accountable to God. And kind of side note to the side note here, Peter, in 1 Peter 2:9 says that you and I are a royal priesthood. You and I, in that sense, you and I are only accountable to one, and that is to our great high priest. But back to Israel. Remember, Israel had no king for the first 600 years or so of their existence. Once they were ordained a nation there at Sinai, about 600 years passed, they had no king. But even after a king was allowed by God, and that comes in, I don't remember if it's in 1 Samuel, even after that, God changed the system to where the kings and the priests existed side by side. But even at that, the king was accountable to the priests, not the priest accountable to the king. The higher authority still belonged to the priesthood. The priests were the ones who anointed the kings, not the kings anointing the priest. So the priesthood still was ultimately responsible, and the high priest ultimately responsible to God. But by the time of these Hebrews, by the time of our study in John, study of the Gospels, and these Hebrews, the priests, particularly the high priest, were appointed by the Romans. And as we saw in our study of John, that position was bought and sold depending on who had the deepest pockets and the most political clout. Had nothing to do with the succession as it was supposed to have. And so, in a way, when this writer said in verse 1, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men, he was taking a swipe at what the priesthood had become. In fact, as we read in John, and actually I guess it's in all four Gospels, we hear so much about, and in Acts, we hear so much about the chief priests. They had gained that level of being over everything. It wasn't the succession that God had ordained it to be, and so he was taking a swipe at them. And so there's more going on behind the scenes here, and probably way more than I've seen or read about behind the scenes than what we know of, and than what meets the eye. So what were they appointed to do? They were appointed in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. So, what's the difference between gifts and sacrifices? What do you think?
Gifts are offered in thanksgiving, or they can be both, I guess. Gifts are offered in thanksgiving, sacrifices offered for sin. That's
part of it. Yeah. That's part of it. What else?
Gifts are an expression of honor. The context of, the purpose of giving that gift, and the sacrifice is more like an obligation and changing the behavior. Yeah.
In fact, I didn't think to dig this out. I've got a whole chart. You know how I'm about charts. I got a whole chart that I made about all the different offerings. Some of them were voluntary. Some of them were compulsory. That is one of the differences between gifts and sacrifices. Some the thank offerings and many of those they were voluntary, but there were others like the whole burnt offering that was compulsory. I mean, you had to do this. Any other thoughts on the differences between them?
Sacrifices seem like it hurts.
Exactly. That is exactly right. You've heard of give and then give till it hurts. That's exactly what it is. The word sacrifice literally means, if you take the Greek word, and I guess in the Septuagint as well, but the word literally means a victim. That's what the word means, is a victim, which means something had to die for the sacrifice. And a gift, like we said, a gift is what we think it should be. It's more like a present. It's more like a voluntary offering. So basically, as it's used here, the high priest brought both gifts and sacrifices. He brought both. A gift is a bloodless offering, grain offering, drink offering, those different kinds of offerings. And a sacrifice is a blood offering. So he brought both of those. Whether they were compulsory or voluntary, primarily one involved the life of something and the other one didn't. But this high priest brought both. They were appointed in order to do that, to bring both types of offerings into the presence of God. And so the priest was appointed by God. The priest appointed by God was a human. He was a man taken from among other men, appointed on behalf of men to present gifts and sacrifices to God for the sins of mankind. Anybody got anything interesting they learned or found out about priests as you were reading those scriptures, or any of that background, or anything you've run across you want to share? I've often said I'm bad about just freight training through. I'm not a good facilitator. I don't stop well and make time for discussion. So you just got to jump in there if you've got something to say. Anything else on that? Okay, well, verse 2 then says that the human high priest also had to deal gently. Let me think about that for a minute. He had to deal gently. I think of handling with kid gloves, or walking on eggshells or something. But dealing gently. I see same thing in the NIV. He had to deal gently with those who were ignorant and going astray, or those with the ignorant and the misguided. The human high priest could do that because he was himself beset with or subject to weakness. And in the other lesson that I wrote on this, I went into a great bit about Jesus being the mediator and how he had to be human, and the writer touches on that. This is the reason he had to be a human. He couldn't just from heaven say, "Okay, your sins are forgiven down there." No, he had to be a part of us. He had to feel with us. He had to walk with us. He had to be a human. Well, the high priest could do that because he was himself subject to this same weakness. He was a man. He knew the frailties that mankind had. This phrase, deal gently, in verse 2, is a single compound word. It's a compound word in the Greek, which means one who's able to feel both sides. Who can feel all around, act with moderation, because they have experienced both sides. He, as the high priest, he experienced the priesthood, but he also experienced humanity. Of course, we know Jesus did that too, but we're talking about the human priest, because he feels the same things. He feels all the way around. It's like taking the middle ground. One illustration was, it's like a counselor who listens to a person's difficulties with an understanding ear, but also doesn't get so wrapped up in the problem that they can't help. Sometimes you try to help someone, you're too close to the situation to really be of any help. You're too emotionally involved. It takes somebody that can take a step back and understand the situation. So that's what he was. He could see both sides of the issue. He had to deal gently. He had to do that. You don't want someone who's apathetic, but you don't want someone who falls apart on you either. So it's the middle ground. And so who is it that he has to deal gently with? Who's he dealing gently with there in that verse? The ignorant and those going astray. The ignorant and the misguided. The ignorant and those going astray. So, as I asked in your questions, is the sin of ignorance, is it given a free pass? Well, bless your heart, you didn't know any better. No? But what's the policeman say to you if you tell him I didn't know what the speed limit was? Ignorance is no excuse. So no, there's no excuse for even sins done in ignorance. Speaking of the sin of the ignorant and misguided, Vincent's word study said the distinction is drawn between sins of ignorance and sins of presumption in the Old Testament, and I put that in your questions. Atonement for the sins of ignorance was required by the Levitical law as a means of educating. Of educating the moral perception. You need to learn this. And of showing that sin and defilement might exist unsuspectedly. Do you ever think that you might be sinning in something and have no idea you were sinning? You know, I've prayed at times, Lord, you know, open my eyes. What is it, the end of Psalm 139? Psalms 139, can't think right off the top of my head. Search me, O God, and try me to see if there is any wicked way within me. I prayed that so many times. Open my eyes, peel back the layers of the onion, and let me see. And if there's something I don't need to be doing, I want to know. And if there's something I should be doing, I want to know that too. He goes on to say, Vincent goes on to say that God saw evil where men did not, and that his test of purity was stricter than theirs. I mean, God's test of purity is perfection. And so we need to know that. And it just in speaking of arrogant sin, just because I put that in your lesson, William Barclay called this the sin of the arrogant or presumptuous sin, cold and calculated sin. It's doing exactly what you know is wrong. The deliberate sin did not find its atonement in sacrifice. The sin of ignorance is pardonable, but the sin of presumption is not. There is no sacrifice for a sin of presumption. We talk about, you know, the unpardonable sin. That's what it is. It's a sin that you refuse to ask for forgiveness for. You can't receive forgiveness if you don't admit that it's sin. Or you may admit it's sin, but I'm going to do it anyway. There is no forgiveness for that sin. So how is the priest taken from among men able to deal gently with these ignorant and misguided souls so well? Because, second part of that, because he himself also is subject to or beset with weakness. And the King James Version puts it this way. It says, he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And, you know, we talk about reading the King James Version, and, you know, I don't understand those words, and it's hard. But sometimes it's good that we know what these words are. That word compassed, or as we see, subject to or beset with, all that's the same word. The word literally means to be encircled with. And I love in I think it's chapter 12 where it talks about, let us lay aside the sin that so easily besets us. That's the sin that trips us up, and we all have those. We all have those things that we struggle with that causes us to trip up. But this is said, he is encompassed with, he is compassed all around with sin. And so he has to be so careful. It's all around him. And it's all around us. Whether we are participating in it or not, it is all around us. And as I was studying this last night, the tense is that not only is it all around us, but if it's not kept in check, it will gain control. And you're like, well, now, sin can be all around. I'm not going to participate in that. I mean, all you have to do is look at TV commercials and TV programs, and you know, it's everywhere. I'm not going to participate in that. Think about this. This is what came to mind as I was reading this. Foul language. Is it not getting worse? It's getting worse. I mean, we were getting gas yesterday, and this woman on the other side, Joe heard this come out of her mouth. He said, I leaned over and looked. I know she's talking about price, but still, you know, one word in particular. You know, that one word that the little boy in A Christmas Story got his mouth washed out with soap over? It's becoming more and more prevalent. Years ago, you know how I am about TV crime dramas. I was, when I take lunch every day, and I probably told you this story before, I'd go in from work and I would eat lunch and watch The Sopranos. Well, it was on some station other than HBO, so all the bad words were bleeped out. But you knew what they were saying. I never said any of that, but those words began to rummage around in my mind. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it came out my mouth. And so I quit watching it. But what do we do now? It's everywhere. You can't voluntarily block it out anymore. So I don't have the answer for that. I just said we've got to be more careful, because if you allow anything that first foothold in your mind, it's only going to be a matter of time before it comes out our mouth. So, and because he is encircled with this sin, or he is himself beset with weakness, because of that, verse 3, because of all of that, he is obligated not only to offer sacrifices for sins as for the people, but what else does he have to do? For himself. He says, look, I'm just as bad as you are. I have to offer sacrifices for my own sin. But there was something really interesting about this, and I didn't pick up on it, or I didn't know it until I was looking at some stuff today. The word for in this verse, in verse 3, is a word that means around. And we talked about that, all around, encircling. So listen to that. And because of being encircled with this sin all around him, he is obligated to offer sacrifices around sin, as around the people, so also around himself. That's on his own level. But here's what's interesting. In verse 1, the King James Version uses the word for this way. It says, every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men. It's a little different than either the NIV or the NASB. And in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. And the word for there is a different word. And I thought, well, why would it be different? And so I read on, and the word for there is the word that means over. In verse 3, it means all around, on the same level, we might say. And in verse 1, it means over. So listen to it this way. Every high priest taken from among men is ordained over men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer gifts and sacrifices over sin. You see the difference in those two? One is on the same level, and the other is in authority over. So I just thought that was interesting, how much more we gain when we know what the words actually mean. And these Hebrews would have understood the difference in that. They would have understood the authority in verse 1 and understood the connection then in verse 3. Well, then we come to verse 4. Can someone just decide to be a priest? No, you can't just decide. He says, and no one takes the honor to himself, but he receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. Aaron was the very first one to be called, and so therefore his descendants were called. And by the way, did you happen to go back and read what happened when someone just decided? It wasn't a pretty picture, was it? There was another one that I forgot to mention. You can jot this down and read it later. This is in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, where King Uzziah, and King Uzziah was a good king. Remember, Isaiah said in the year King Uzziah died, I went into the temple where he saw the Lord high and lifted up. But King Uzziah was a very good king, and he reigned, something like 50-some years. But King Uzziah decided that he thought he ought to go into the temple and burn sacrifice. That didn't go over well either. Anybody remember that story? Amy, you remember that story? Remember what happened to him? No. He was struck with leprosy, which was God's grace, because what he should have done was struck dead. God takes this priesthood thing very seriously. So I ask you the question, why do you think the writer belabored the point when it was something that the Hebrews would have known very well? Why did he just hammer this home when they would have already known all this?
It's just a reminder.
Just as a reminder. What did you start saying?
I think that so that they would understand who sent Jesus.
Right. Right.
He didn't just come on his own.
He didn't just come on his own.
He didn't just elect to take that position.
Oh, I think I would never be a priest.
Yeah.
No. And because God takes this priesthood thing very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so now he's talked about the human priest. All about it. What he is, what he's done, his weakness all around. And then in verse 5, then he's Christ on the other hand. As verse 4 reminds the Jewish listeners, so that the human high priest did not take this honor upon himself, he adds in verse 5, so also Christ. Now what's the title? Christ. He doesn't say, so Jesus decided to do this, or so Jesus did not glorify himself. No, so Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest either. He also was appointed. As I said earlier, I'll make note of the way that the writer uses these various titles. They're not random. Everyone has a purpose. So then he continues in verses 5 and 6. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he, God, said to him, Christ, thou art my son, the other title. Today I have begotten thee. Just as he, God, also said in another passage, thou art a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So the same one who called him son, as we saw in chapter 1, is the same one who said that he was to be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And in this we see that Jesus is superior to the human high priest. I guess I should say Christ there. Is superior to the human high priest who was taken from among men, because this high priest, Christ, was taken, he was chosen not from among men, but where was he chosen from among whom? From among the Godhead. From among the Trinity. He was chosen among the Godhead to be priest. So think about this, and I put these think about questions in there. When in time did that take place? When in time was Christ appointed to the high priesthood?
I thought it was in the beginning.
In the beginning?
I just said John 1:1.
Yeah, before. Before the foundations of the world, before anything. That was determined in the very beginning. Well, when did the Jewish, and we're talking about this high priesthood here that we see in Hebrews and we see in the Gospels, when did it end? Because they don't have them today, so when did it end?
Did it end at the resurrection?
No.
The
Because remember,
crucifixion?
remember in Acts we're still seeing priests.
Well, but they don't have really any authority. They just think they do.
Well, yeah, they think they do, but they're still offering sacrifices. They're still doing all this stuff. So when did they stop?
Was it the destruction of the temple?
Yeah, when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the priesthood stopped. In fact, I was trying to remember. I didn't take the time to dig this out, but they're not the sects, the Sadducees and Pharisees and the priesthood are really not even mentioned after AD 70 in history, because they just sort of disbanded. One writer said that after that pretty much the rabbis took the role of authority in the synagogues, because the synagogues stayed in existence. Remember, the synagogues came into existence during the exile when they couldn't get back to the temple to make the sacrifices, so they became gathering places. And So the rabbi had the role of authority when they were in exile. When they came back, then the priesthood took over again until AD 70, and then the rabbis, and even today, the rabbi pretty much has the authority over individual synagogues. And I'm sure there's a hierarchy of rabbis, maybe, I don't know what that is, but that's who has it today. And then I asked you, how long before Aaron's priesthood was Melchizedek's priesthood? Not necessarily in years. I didn't ask you to dig that up and give me a time, but just in time frame.
6 generations.
Was it? Whoa, let me write that down.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron.
Well, cool. Be sure I want to get that right down after we get through. I want to have that. I was just thinking in terms of Melchizedek. We read about him where?
With Abraham.
With Abraham in Genesis, and early in Genesis, and then we read about the priesthood being established in Exodus. So a long time, 6 generations. That's good to know. I've got some really neat things about Melchizedek when we get to that chapter too, who he might have been. So, but anyway, any other thoughts on the questions there? That anything I might have left out on that? Well, then he continues. Let's see. I did that. We talked about those questions. So how did this appointment work out? Jesus was appointed. Verses 5 and 6. He didn't glorify himself. He was appointed. He was a son. He was a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So, how did this appointment work out? As the saying goes, how's that working for you? Look at verse 7. In the days of his flesh. Now we're talking about the human Christ, Jesus. In the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. So first of all, in the days of his flesh, the scene portrayed here, most scholars think, is the Garden of Gethsemane. One commentary said it was a picture of what took place in those dark hours on the cross. But every other commentary that I have referred to this crying out, this offering up prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears, was a picture of, or not a picture of, but it was the actual event of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. One writer said the writer of Hebrews now turns to the training Messiah received for his work as a priest. So by saying in the days of his flesh, he's now, as we said, he's turning back to Christ's humanity. So think about what that means. And I used this illustration last time, and it was just too good to not use again. But think of a sheet of paper with a line drawn on that paper and a dot in the middle of it. Line on paper with a dot in the middle of it, just a tiny dot in the middle of it. Though think of a line, the line goes to your left to eternity, past, and goes to your right to eternity, future. And right in the middle of that is a dot. And it is that dot that portrays the days of his flesh. In the days of his flesh, it's just one tiny dot in a timeline of eternity past to eternity future. 33 years. When you think about eternity, that's less than a dot. Such a tiny amount of time. And during the days of his flesh, during the time that he was here, in this vast eternity past to eternity future, that short window when he was here, it said he offered up both prayers and supplication. So the word prayers, I looked up those words, they're Greek meanings. The word prayers means specific, special requests. We do our prayers and our praises on Sunday, and we hear people talk about prayers and supplications or prayers and petitions, and prayers is that. It is our prayer list. It is those things that we lift up, those things that we share among one another. Those are the prayers. And the word petitions or supplications is a different word that has more of the idea of a request or a special request. The idea of an appeal. We might use the phrase asking a favor. This, I think, corresponds to the gifts and sacrifices that we saw in verse 1 that the high priest would offer. Jesus, he himself was the sacrifice. We saw when we studied John 17 that Jesus, as the great high priest, prayed for himself first. Remember that? He prayed for the sacrifice. And who was the sacrifice? He was the sacrifice. He prayed for himself. And he also prayed for those who would believe because of the sacrifice. And so here, though, the prayers and supplications, or the prayers and petitions, are more intense than they were in John 17. And here now, the writer is talking about in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with what? How did he offer them up? Loud cries and tears. He prayed intently in John 17, but he wasn't crying, and it wasn't loud cries, and it wasn't with tears. The word crying here is a word that literally means to make an outcry without words. I was trying to think. I can't remember what it is. There's some movie. It just this one scene's in my mind. I have no idea what it goes to. But in this movie, something traumatic has happened, and this person is literally, and nothing coming out, no sound coming out until a few seconds pass, and then the sound comes out. But that's as intense of crying that you can get to. It's actually the same word that's found in Job 34:28 when Job talks about the cry of the afflicted. But we know this story from the Garden of Gethsemane. And we know how Jesus suffered there and how he begged that the cup be taken away. And so what did he pray for? The rest of verse 7 says he cried with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him. And of course we know that's God. Save him from death. And it says he was heard because of his piety. So what did he pray for? He prayed that he wouldn't die. How'd you say it, Sherry?
I said first he did, but then he went on to say,
well,
your will be done.
He goes on to that. But he first prays, and that's all this writer is talking about here, is the first part. The cry that he made. And it said he was heard. So, as everyone's translations say, he prayed to the one who was able to save him from death. The word from. What's your say?
Out of.
Good. Because every other, let's see.
New Living.
New Living, okay. Because NIV says from, every other translation is from. And so if we read it from, don't read it out of, if we read it from, save him from death, it says he was heard. Did God save him from death? Did God keep him from dying? No. He didn't. So how do we explain that verse to someone?
And the way I was thinking about it, I couldn't explain it really, because to me, out of death sounds like a permanent place he would be. And
you mean death is the permanent place?
Yeah, this comment, out of death, like death is a destination. It's a permanent place to be.
Okay, yeah.
So when I look at this translation, it makes me think I don't know. It just gave me a different way of looking at things because out of death sounds a lot different than from.
Death, exactly. And that's why this is so hard to understand. And actually, out of is the correct word there. The word is ek, and it literally means out of or from within. From within might be a really better way for us to read that. He was heard and he was saved from within death. What's that tell us about death? About
See, I looked at it as he was saved from death.
Yeah. So you were looking at it the way we would normally read it, but that's not what it is.
Mm-hmm.
When it says he was saved from within, how can you be taken from within something if you're not in it? Yeah, I was trying to find a good way to say that. But yeah, so he had to die, but he was saved from within death. It was like he was snatched out. He was pulled out from within death. I've heard this scripture taught as Jesus could have actually died in the garden, but God kept him from dying there because he was to die on the cross. Because, it says he was nigh unto death, sweat drops of blood. And like I said, I've heard it taught that if God hadn't intervened, he would have died right there and not made it to the cross. Well, I don't agree with that because Jesus knew he was to die on the cross. He prophesied it. In fact, these words always amaze me, as we saw in John 18, verse 4. Just as the Roman soldiers and the temple guard were coming to arrest him, John says, so Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth. He knew everything that was going to happen, and he went forth anyway. So he knew he was going to die, and so he prayed. He knew that he was going to die on the cross, and so he prayed for God to save him out of or from within the grave. And so, what does it say next? Was he heard? Yes. Why was he heard? What was it about him that made God say, okay, I'll do that?
His reverence.
His reverence? Submission. The NASB says his piety. He was heard because of his piety. The King James Version says he was heard because of his fear. Now, that is not fear in the sense of, I'm afraid I'm going to die. No, it's fear as in reverence. That's a better word there. The NIV says because of his reverent submission. The phrase literally means with caution or to act cautiously. We might say with cautious fear. We often refer to this fear as a reverent fear, but a better word is a cautious fear. Are we to fear God? Absolutely we're to fear God, but it is a cautious fear. When something is dangerous like fire or a gun or a vehicle, we say treat it with respect. Treat it cautiously. Cautious fear. Know how to handle it. Cautious fear. As I was reading that, I was reminded, and I've not read this, I just know this one line out of the book. C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There is a line in there that where I think it's a little girl asks the question about the lion. Of course, the lion is Jesus. And asks the question, is he safe? And the answer is, safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. Should we fear God? Absolutely we should fear God, because he's God. But it's a cautious fear, and it's a reverent fear. But in all of this, even though Jesus was tested severely, he maintained his allegiance to God's will. As you said, ultimately he will say, thy will be done. And this is the one who is our great high priest. Then in verse 8, and actually the NIV I think renders this the best. Verse 8 says, son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. The NASB says, although he was a son. And remember that article a or the is not there. Son though he was, it's the title. So what it goes on to say, son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. Or mine says he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. So what do you think about that statement? About Jesus having to learn obedience. Does it seem odd to you?
No,
It doesn't seem odd to you?
no.
Why is that?
I guess because he came into this world as a human being,
Mm-hmm.
and he had to learn the ways of the earth. He had to learn how to walk, he had to learn how to talk, he had to learn how to communicate. and
Yeah.
he had to learn how to be human
Right.
on this earth.
Right.
And so obedience would have been something that he had to learn like
Right.
everything else.
Right. Exactly.
Well, he was tempted a lot.
He was tempted, yeah, and he learned from that. We just have this tendency to think, wait a minute, Jesus had to learn something? You know, he's God, he's omniscient, he knows everything. Why did he have to learn something? And Sandy's exactly right. Because he was born. Because, you know, he had to teeth, everything that a human being had to do, he had to do, and he had to learn it in that way. I think, is it Luke? When Jesus was 12 years old, I forget what chapter that is, early in Luke, and it may still even be in chapter 2. But even if he talks about he grew in wisdom and in stature. He grew physically and he grew mentally and emotionally. So he grew in that. So he had to do all these things. The omniscient God, the Son, knew what obedience was. After all, he had been obedient in laying aside his glory. In agreeing to this at the very beginning, the second person of the Trinity, agreeing to be Son, to be submissive in role to the Father of the Trinity, to the headship. So he was obedient in laying aside his glory and being made a man, but he never experienced obedience.
Or suffering.
Or suffering, exactly, until he became a human. Did he, as a human, want to die? Was he looking forward to this cross? No. Did he want to suffer? No. And so, as we saw, and the greatest temptation of all was there in the garden to avoid the cross. Well, actually, this temptation began in the wilderness in the early part of the Gospels, where he was tempted to take a shortcut. Let's just bypass all this. Let me just set you on the throne to start with. We'll bypass all the suffering. No. He went through all of that. He didn't want to, but he did. And though he cried out with loud and fervent crying and tears, that was his humanity. So God the Son became obedient to God the Father. In John 6:38, Jesus said he didn't come to do his own will, but the will of the Father. Vincent's word study said that this learning, this obedience, and this learning here was training for his office as a high priest who could be touched with the feeling of human infirmities.
I found this from Barclay, and I liked what it said, when he had been made fully fit for his appointed task. And that is a complete understanding of human frailty.
Yeah, Barclay is so good at explaining some of that. Have you got the whole set?
No.
If you've got Matthew, do you have Matthew? Anyway, if you've got one of the Gospels where he explains what happened in the garden. That is such a powerful explanation of Jesus going from how the submission came about. He prays 3 times and he goes back. That is so powerful. Barclay does a great job in explaining that. I love his teaching on that. But, so he learned from his experience of his suffering. So, the experience. What is it you and I say about experience? Experience is what? The best teacher. What kind of experiences make the best teacher? Bad experiences. Do we ever say that about good experiences? No, we don't ever say that about good experiences. But one quote I read said, and this was some anonymous poet, the writer that I was reading it from didn't know who wrote it, said, "We learned in suffering what we teach in song." I thought about all those great hymns we have. It is well with my soul, Rock of Ages, be not dismayed, whatever betide, God will take care of it. I mean, song, hymn after hymn. Suffering brought about the great songs. Andrew Murray said, we need to learn to look upon and to welcome all suffering as God's message to teach obedience. And I thought, I don't like that statement at all. No, ouch, that's a tough one. So, then beginning, between the suffering of verse 8 and being the source of eternal salvation that we see at the last part of verse 9, Jesus, it says, was made perfect. Verse 9, and having been made perfect, or the NIV says, and once made perfect. Remember that word made means to change from one form into another. And having become, or having been made, that's a past tense, something that happened in the past. And being made perfect, he then became, to all who obey him, the source of eternal salvation. As we've seen, this doesn't mean that before God made Jesus perfect, that he was imperfect. That word is used so often, but that's not what it is. The word perfect here means mature or complete. It literally means to bring to completion, or to the goal, or in terms of function. Its greatest functionability, brought to the greatest point of functionability. God completed everything necessary for salvation through Jesus' suffering. The suffering, we could put it this way, the suffering completed the training. That was the final thing. That was the final thing he had to go through. And because of it, he is the cause, or he is the source, then, of eternal salvation. So the source of eternal salvation for whom? For everybody? What's the scripture say there? For whom? For all who obey him. Is he the source of salvation for those who don't obey him? No. Jesus is the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. He's not the source of salvation for others. Those who do not obey him, do not believe in, and remember those two words are interchangeable in the book of Hebrews. Those who do not believe in him, he is not the source of salvation, although he is the ultimate and only and eternal source of salvation. It's like you're really, really, really thirsty, and someone is standing there with a glass of water. If you don't take it and drink it, it doesn't do you any good. It may quench the world's thirst, but if you don't take it, it won't do anything for your thirst. So he is the source of salvation, but if someone doesn't believe in him, then he is not. To believe, to obey is to believe, and to believe is to obey. And because Son, or the Son, was obedient, what was he designated then? Verse 10. He was designated, he was appointed by God as a high priest. Well, he's not from the tribe of Levi or Aaron, but he's a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, or in the order of Melchizedek. And by saying that, once he says that, the rider then comes to a screeching halt. He throws on the brakes. Hold that thought. We're not going to go down that road just yet. I'd love to, and we can feel him saying, I'd love. Oh man, I want to do this so bad. But some of you just aren't ready for this yet. I don't care as teachers how badly you've wanted to show them the next thing. You can't wait, but you can't do that just yet because they're not ready for it. So what I want to know is, and I don't have an answer for this, how did he know? How did he know they weren't ready? When you're talking to a group, I love this about Buffett, and Katrina will probably watch this later. I love this about Buffett, but I always know if they're not getting it by Katrina's face. I'm like, okay, I need to back up and start over here. Because and sometimes you just know, teachers, you know, you can tell by looking, they just aren't getting it. And so he said, if he was there, we might understand that. If he's there in person and he's teaching this and he begins to see their eyes glaze over, their heads nod back, I'm going to have to change up here a little bit. Or it could be that he just knew them so well that he knew this was getting deep. Now, there were probably Jewish believers in this crowd that were like you all. Yeah. Give us more. But then there were some that were beginning to nod off, or some that were just beginning to get agitated with him. And so but the believer, and there might even be some of the believers who are saying, oh, wait a minute, that's just getting too deep. So in verse 11, he abruptly stops and says, I have just so much more to tell you about Melchizedek, but this is going to get deep and you're not ready for this yet. And so let's think about that for a minute. He said, this translation, concerning him or concerning this. Now, there's differences of opinion of whether this is the three different things. Concerning him with a capital H, that would give us an indication that Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Christ. Or concerning him, lowercase, just Melchizedek, or concerning this whole teaching of this eternal priesthood. Could be any one of those three. Concerning this, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain. Now, why is it hard to explain? Is it hard for him to explain, or is it hard for them to get?
It's hard for them to get.
It's hard for them to get. Why is it? Well, why is that? Because they should have known who Melchizedek was, right? I mean, they knew the song. They knew likely the story from Genesis. Why would it be hard for them to get?
They just weren't maybe progressing as he felt like they should be in their lives.
Right. They knew the history. They knew the facts. But they didn't know how this connected to Jesus' priesthood. Okay, that's why it's hard for them. Why is it hard for us? Why would he have to? If he was here talking to us today and he said, I'm just wait, I'll get back to that in a minute because this is hard. Why is it hard for us to understand?
Well, that's why we're here.
Well, you got to let everything go and listen.
Yeah.
You got to clear your plate. You got to really listen.
Right. Well, why does just even saying the name Melchizedek make it hard to understand?
We didn't live in those times.
Right.
We didn't.
Because if not for the study, who's Melchizedek and what's he got to do with anything?
See, the only thing they had then was the Old Testament.
Right, exactly.
They didn't have a New Testament.
Right.
So what they had was Scripture.
Yep.
Then
Yep.
was the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly. And not only do we not know who Melchizedek is, we don't know the history around him. So, like I said, that's why we're here. That's why we mine this out and we dig it out so that we can learn the narrative, we can learn the history, and see how it ties in to what Jesus has done and the position that Jesus has even today of sitting at the right hand of the Father. He is in his role today as great high priest. He will not be king until he returns at the second coming. So he's prophet and priest and king. He was prophet as he walked on the earth. He was priest. He is priest now, and he will be king when he returns. So that's why it's so hard. The point or the objective that the writer is after is that the New Testament sacrifice made by the Messiah, the anointed one, is better than, remember, everything's a better than, this is a better picture than that, is better than the sacrifices that were made by human priests. And it's hard to understand. It's hard to explain. It is deep. And it is especially difficult to make it clear to someone who doesn't want to hear it. I mean, it's one thing to have really good groups of women in these Bible studies who want to hear it, but if you try to explain it to somebody who doesn't want to hear it, I mean, they just don't want to hear it. And so he said, he goes on to say, it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing, or you, the NIV says, you no longer try to understand. It's not that they weren't smart enough. They simply had no desire to learn it. Even the believers may have, as the church of Ephesus in Revelation 2, they may have lost their first love. I mean, you know how it is. Sometimes people will get saved or a new Christian, and man, they just can't get enough of reading the Bible. I mean, they just want to read everything they get their hands on. They want to know everything they can about it. They just have an insatiable hunger for it. But then as time goes by, they just simply get lazy. And they have no push. The word literally means no push, no desire to learn the word. I have actually had women say to me about our Bible studies, and I just really don't want to go that deep. You know, and I mean, it all hurt my feelings. I hurt, though, for someone who just simply has no desire to know the word. But they just... For the Hebrews, what caused this? In chapter 2, he warned them about drifting, about letting the world, life, get in the way. In chapters 3 and 4, he warned against the danger of encroaching doubt, hardening of the heart. He said the tense of it was, it's on the verge of happening. Don't let it happen. And then here he says you have become dull of hearing, or you no longer try. And the tense here is, this has already happened. You don't even try anymore. Neglect had done its job.
Mine says you don't seem to listen.
You don't seem to listen. And what causes someone not to listen? You ever have anything on TV and maybe your husband or someone is watching it and you don't even hear it? Why do you not hear it?
Just tune it out.
You tune it out. You have no interest in it. You don't
Your interest is elsewhere.
Your interest is elsewhere, and that's the way they were. They weren't even listening. Their interest was elsewhere. So then verse 12, and so he takes this from verse 12 on through actually all of chapter 6. He takes this sidetrack, and he's beginning to bring them back in. He's trying to reel them back in with this. And he says, by this time, and the word there for time, I'm speaking of time, I'm running tight here. The word for time is chronos, which we call say this fast, call clock time. It's literally physical passing time. By this time, it means time in sense of distance. You've been believers long enough you should be doing the teaching yourself. The King James Version says, because of the time. Now that's interesting too, in that because of the times we live in, you should be teaching. And when I saw that, I thought, that shows an urgency. That's where you and I should be today. Because of the times we live in, we should be much more urgent in wanting to share this. But these folks, and just like in our own churches, they become lazy, and then the writer takes the time to admonish them. By this time, you ought to be teachers. So what do they need to do instead? You need someone to teach you the elementary principles or the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. Every discipline has its first steps. So the word elementary has in it elemental. The elementary school, the elements, the very first, the basics, we would say. Every discipline has its first elements. In education, ABCs, 1, 2, 3s. In art, it's primary colors or perspective. In sewing, Sherry, I thought about you. It's threading a needle and sewing on a button, which is about as far as I've gotten with that. But
because your interests are elsewhere.
There you go. My interests are elsewhere. What was it Vince Lombardi said to his football team? Gentlemen, this is a football. The very basics, the very beginning. When a child forgets their lines and says something like, the Lord is my shepherd, and that's all I need to know about that, we laugh. It's cute. But if an adult says that, we should cry. But like I said in the lesson, start where you are. Don't berate yourself. If that's where you are, start there and go from there. Then in verses 13 and 14, for everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is a baby. Solid food is for the mature, or may say complete or perfect, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. So I'll go over this kind of quickly here. The King James Version says, for everyone that uses or only partakes of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. The word unskilled here means ignorant of. It's a word that means, the word unskilled or not accustomed to, or need someone to teach you. That word literally is the word put together with an A on the front of it. Anytime you add an A to a word, it means like the opposite. It's like, you've got it all together. Not. You've not got it all together, is what he's saying to them. They just didn't put it together. One commentary said the baby has the word, he just does not use the word. And then verse 14 says, but solid food or meat is for the mature. And the word mature, as we saw, is the same word as perfect or complete. The writer says the mature who because of practice. Now, I don't want to skip this because this is very important. The mature who because of practice or because of constant use. That word there means they make it a habit. They make it a part of their lives, their day-to-day lives. It says they make a habit of having their senses trained. Your senses, your perception is trained. Or they've trained themselves to discern good from evil. In other words, we are trained to be aware of what we call red flags. When you listen to something new, or you read something new, or I'll share this thing I saw on TV, it's like your ears perk up. And a red flag goes up, like, something's not quite right about this. You just have a check in your spirit. We were watching TV yesterday, and there was I don't know if you've seen this commercial. There was a commercial that came on, and it refers to a website that is called HeGetsUs.com. So if y'all want to look that up, HeGetsUs.com, and it's all about Jesus. He gets us. He gets us. He understands us. Well, in a sense, that's just what we've been talking about. Because he was made human, he gets us. But there was just something about, and I can't lay my finger on it. There's something about this that just, I'm like, I don't know about that. Now, honestly, I've not done enough research on it. I can't tell you. It may be a great thing. I don't know. But I just know it just raised my antenna. And as I did look at the site again today, there's one line, and it actually has a link for reading plans that takes you to YouVersion, the Bible app that you can have on your phone. I thought, well, that's good. But what it says is, learn about him. Let's see. I don't know if I wrote that down. I didn't write. Learn about him on your own terms. And I'm like, no.
What does that mean?
It may mean on your own schedule, on the way you want, but what I hear when I see that is, I want to learn about him on his terms, not on my terms. So again, I'm just throwing that out there. I know nothing other than that, but that discernment is what I'm talking about. I have a bookmark that I made, and some of you may have this. It says, discernment is the overflow of focused meditation on God's Word. Is focused meditation on God's Word easy? No, it's not easy. There's too much vying for our time, and I'm just as bad as you all are, but we have to develop the habit. These Hebrews had so abused or so neglected their senses that they could no longer distinguish good from evil. Or as we'll say next time, distinguish the picture book, the Old Testament, from the reality, which is the New Testament. Andrew Murray said, in the things of God, a tender conscience and a surrendered will are more than the highest intellect. A tender conscience and a surrendered will. So that's what we must have. Any other, I've run you over just a little, any other thoughts or comments, or I'll stay around as long if anybody wants to talk afterward. Anything else?
Teaching in our ladies' Bible study about that, we're going through Psalm 119. And verse 15, 16 talks about meditating on the Word, what the results of that is, and then delighting in the Word.
Oh, yeah.
So the more you meditate on it, the more you delight in what the Scriptures are saying, and that delight brings more joy and more satisfaction and then contentment in Him.
Yeah.
So when it talks, it's interesting how it kind of correlated when it was talking about on the meal, and needing that solid food, you need meat, you gotta have that sustenance to grow. Yeah, exactly. That is so good. I always think of that beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. And the tense of those words are in the continuous. The more you hunger and thirst, the more you're filled. The more you're filled, the more you hunger, and it just builds, right? Anything else? All right, well, let's pray. Father, there's just so much here. I mean, there's just so much, and I learned so much more than